Hello, I'm Brian Avery, North Carolina historian, and we're going to start a series and teach you why North Carolinians are called Tar Heels. We're going back through the 1800s. We're going to show you the products that were used to build ships with. We're going to show you how this state got started in Bath, North Carolina, and we're going to also make products and show you. It'll be a little series that will actually show you the history of this state and where that nickname came from. We'll be making tar. We'll be making turpentine. Okay? We'll show you some things about coopering, about how they made their barrels and buckets to ship the products down to Wilmington. We'll also be covering other subjects along the way. We'll be doing some traveling, hopefully, and show you how England needed North Carolina for the products to build these ships with. But today we're going to start out talking about the longleaf pine. There was over 90 million acres of longleaf pine that stretched from Virginia to Texas. And those longleaf pine trees are where the products come from, which is why the pine tree is so important to this state, and was and still is, but that's how we got our start. Basically, two quick facts. If you go back all the way into Genesis in the Bible, Genesis 6:14, ever since they started putting planks together to build ships with the ark, God tells him to build an ark and to pitch it within and without with pitch. That's Genesis 6:14. Noah did that, built his ark. Okay, so we're not talking about something that started in North Carolina. We're talking about something that started in Genesis in the Bible when they built the ark, or when they started building ships rather than dugout canoes. When you put two boards together, you've got the seal between those cracks. But today what we're going to concentrate on is the pine tree and get us all started by understanding a few things about the pine tree. Okay? This time of year in North Carolina, in the spring, we get the pine pollen. As you see on this hood of this pickup truck, you can wash it one day, and the next morning it's the same way, because these trees are putting off this pollen this time of year and fertilizing the cones on the pines. Okay, we're going to show you how to identify a longleaf pine this time of year in the 1st of April versus the other pines in the area of North Carolina. And this is what there were 90 million acres of back when settlers first came to this country. And it's simple this time of year because each longleaf gets a candle in the very end of the limbs. If you can see that, it's a really pretty white end to the limb that will grow these needles as it progresses through the years. But in the springtime, early April like we're in, you'll see these white candles on the end of each limb, and that's what they're called, candles, and they're new growth on the limb. Now, another way why they're called longleaf pines, if you look right there, we've got about 14.5 inches of needle length on there, and versus your loblolly, which has 6 to 8 usually. And these grow in clusters of 3, 12 to 14 inches. I have got some out here that are longer than that. They're 16, 18 inches long. And so the long needles is why they call them longleaf pines. Okay? Now, you got your candles, your long needles, and the way you can find out what's growing in your yard in North Carolina, if you've got pine cones this size that fall off your trees that you have to get up, this is a loblolly. This is a longleaf pine. As you can see, it's bigger than my hand, okay? And these are smaller. This is loblolly, this is longleaf, okay? Now these trees are too young, they're only about 6 years old. We planted about 1,000 of them in the county, and I planted some here on my farm because years ago, if you look right over here, you'll see the stumps that are still in the ground that they left along the property lines. Those were trees that were cut and the stump was left as a property line, and of course all the outside has rotted away and left just the tree heart, which we'll discuss in a moment. But when you're riding up and down the road, and you especially in the southern part of our state, if you look outside the road this time of year in early April, you'll see these white candles is what they're called. Okay, if you have this size pine cone, you have loblolly. If you have this size, you have a longleaf pine in your yard. If you have this size pine cone, you live in California, okay? This is off of sugar pine, and they are the largest cones of any pine cone in the pine family, and a friend of mine out in California sent these to me. Now what you're looking at now is a loblolly tree. That's what's putting off all this pollen right now. If you look behind this other bigger, greener tree to your left, right there in the middle, that dark green evergreen. Pines stay green all year long. In the spring they have aments, which are male organs that put off this dust that goes to the small cones and fertilizes them and makes cones that drop seeds in 20 months and form new pine trees when they grow out of the ground. So what you're looking at is the top of a loblolly, and you can see how short the leaves or needles look compared to those long leaves that I showed you. We planted about 1,000 long leaves in North Carolina a few years ago, and that was what we were discussing a while ago. Now this one is a loblolly. They're cousins, they're close, in fact, they say a loblolly, the name came from the stew that the men ate on the ships back then. It was so sloshy and sloppy, and they grew in such a nasty bottom that they adopted that name and started calling these trees loblollies because of the junk they grew in down in the woods, in the bottoms. And so those little brown tufts that you see up in the tree are what's putting off the pollen this time of year and covering everything, and that dust will go to those new little baby cones and basically, you know, start the cycle of life. Okay, so now we're going to walk over there and I'm going to tell you how a pine tree functions. Okay, what you're looking at now, this is a loblolly tree right up here in front of us. You can see the smaller cones, you can see the little aments, the male dusting organs, okay? This time of year that are putting out the pollen really close. You can see what they look like. Now, as she pans down, you will see that some of the longleaf pines that we planted a few years ago versus the loblolly. So if you pan back up and look at the shorter leaves on this tree versus the longer leaves on the longleaf pine, now you can see the difference in the two pine trees that grow in this area. Now this is a loblolly, it's not a longleaf. A longleaf will put off about twice as much product as a loblolly, but most of the longleaf were done away with. We'll go over that in another show. So the loblollies still grow in North Carolina. We use these to produce the products we're going to show you because there's not a lot of longleaf left to do it with. And so, but these will do the same thing, but only about half as much, okay? But to help you understand how this tree functions, there's roots under the ground. The moisture comes in here. There's two types of wood in this tree. Underneath this bark, there's a white wood called a sap wood. And it takes water from the tree roots up this tree to the limbs and the leaves and feeds the tree. The heart of this tree is red. And that red wood, heartwood, contains an oleoresin. That oleoresin, O-L-E-O-R-E-S-I-N, oleoresin, is a natural defense system for this tree. If this tree another tree falls against it, knocks the bark off of it, goes through that sapwood on the outside that's feeding the limbs, there are tubes coming from the heart of this tree, just like this, to the outside. They go back in there to the heart this way. Okay, water, which is called sap, comes up this way through this wood underneath this bark. That heartwood has tubes, veins coming to the outside of this tree. God designed this tree so if another tree died, fell against it, knocked the bark off of it, it would cut those tubes, and that resin from the heart will leak out, leak down the face of this tree and soak in that white wood and turn it hard as a brick so a beetle can't penetrate it. That's resin or oleoresin. Sap is the water that feeds the tree. Resin is the natural defense system from the heart of the tree. When this tree dies, this outside soft or sapwood will rot away, leaving that heart, because that resin that's in the heart is flammable. Bugs won't eat it, water won't destroy it and rot it. So that heart being filled with this resin will last basically forever in the woods. Okay? What we're looking at here is one of those tree hearts I was telling you about. This tree was cut off. The outside sapwood rotted away from this stump, leaving this heart that's filled with oleoresin. This heart will not rot. That's why it's still here. It won't rot away. Bugs won't eat it. It'll be here until a forest fire sets it on fire, or until somebody kind of like me comes along and cuts it up. Now this tree heart we used for many, many years, 200, 300 years in this country, to start our chimney fires, because the minute you put a match to it, it liquefies this resin, which is very flammable, so the wood itself catches on fire easily and is very hard to put out. So you put some of that in your fireplace or your stove or whatever you're doing, cooking, and heat it, set it afire, and then as it builds up a huge fire, you can lay your other logs on top of it and it would start a fire for you. So they use this and go through the woods. They would find these stumps left that the outside had rotted away from the tree, split it up, and that is called light wood, and or fat wood. Because it's soaked with this resin, they called it fat wood. It was called lighter wood because they used it for torches in the early days. You'd cut you a piece of it off, set fire to it, and you could walk through the woods and see at night. Well, country people got all that mixed up and put it together and started calling it fat lightered. So as I grew up, what we went out into these woods and looked for was fat lightered stumps to split up, to bring home, to put in the fires and start fires with. Now fat lightwood, fat lightered, tree heart, pine tree heart. This is longleaf pine tree heart. It could be 300 years old. It could be 1,000 years old. Nobody knows, because it could have laid in these woods for that long. It could be 100 years old. But we gather it up, like I say, when I was a kid growing up, and everybody else around the country, we gather this up and split it. And you see that red resin in there? You see it soaked in that heart? That resin, that liquid looking stuff right there, see it red? That's flammable, and if you could smell it, it smells just like turpentine, tar pitch. That's what we're trying to extract, and what they extracted to make tar, to soak the roots and stuff on a sailing vessel so it wouldn't rot, and also to cook it down and make pitch, which is what they would seal up the sides of the ships with so that it would stop the water from coming through the boards. Now this is what we'll be working with. Today you have understood how pine tree functions. You've understood the difference in a longleaf and some other shortleaf pines. There's several different kinds, okay? But I'm just talking about a couple of them right now that we use. And this tree heart is from some of the old longleaf that died out here 100 years ago. Or they didn't die out, they were actually cut for timber after they were turpentined. But we're going to show you in this series how those guys took this resource and made it into an industry, a worldwide industry. In fact, most of it that went around the world came from this area. And we're going to show you how it was used, how they built ships with it, how they used it for medicinal purposes, how it moved into turpentine for lamp oil, that in the 1830s when we had our first energy crisis. We're going to be showing you what these pioneers did that came here that caused them to get the nicknames Tar Heel and the Tar Heel. Okay, and you can see if you light it, you see how that burns so easily? That is the resin inside that tree heart. That's why we used it to start our house fires. You see how fast that's growing? And if you hold it up, the heat, you'll see that liquid. You see that liquid running out of it right there? That is tar. That resin is tar. Okay, see that liquid running out and underneath the fire where it's heating the wood? See it running down it? That is tar, pine tar.